So Pokemon Sword and Shield came out about a month ago, and reactions to it were mixed. Longtime Pokemon fans tore into the game for a lot of questionable decisions, most notably the absence of more than half of the franchise's Pokemon. The more optimistic were hoping that, as Game Freak said, this narrower focus would lead to a more polished experience. Instead, they got this. But I'm not all that interested in discussing how Sword and Shield is disappointing right now. I'm more interested in the why. Why does Game Freak seem to have fallen into bad design habits? Why does it rush games out to satisfy fans who will be disappointed when they see what they're getting? Why, oddly, does it keep introducing nearly 100 new Pokemon every generation when it's not even willing to hang on to the ones that fans already know and love? Some of these questions may be impossible to answer, but I think I have a pretty good beat on the last one. To solve this particular puzzle, I only need 3 pieces: Pokemon, the Sanrio Company, and Paranoia Agent. Confused? You won't be after this episode of Cinnamon Noir. Paranoia Agent is a 2004 TV anime directed by the late great Satoshi Kon. Like many of Kon's works, it focuses on the discontents of modern life and the warped, demented reactions that people often exhibit in response to their problems and frustrations. The character who begins the story, and really the central driver of what happens in it, is a young woman named Tsukiko Sagi who works for a character design firm. Her employer, which is a lot like the real-life Sanrio Company, creates fictional animal mascots to be printed on t-shirts and hats, made into stuffed animals, and generally merchandised in every way imaginable. As the story begins, Tsukiko has just created the biggest success of her career, a cute pink dog named Miromi, which has become a national sensation. At first, Tsukiko basks in the reflected glory of her big success, but in no time at all that sunshine begins to fade. She finds herself suffering from creative block, throwing away all her drawings because she's dissatisfied with them. For weeks on end, she's unable to create a new mascot, even though her company depends on a steady stream of characters for its business. Coworkers begin to gossip about her, calling her a prima donna who thinks she doesn't need to work hard. Her boss, who initially put up with the lack of output because Miromi was so successful, starts to turn impatient, and ultimately loses it and rants at her that she needs to work if she expects to be paid. Emotionally bruised, frightened, and at a loose end in her career, Tsukiko is wandering back to her apartment down a dark alley one night when she's suddenly and brutally attacked by a young boy with a baseball bat, and ends up in the hospital. Her story about being attacked ends up causing another sensation, but not a positive one. People all over the city start reporting that they've seen the same boy, and news stories about juvenile delinquency and societal collapse run rampant. Ironically, though, the attack seems to have solved a lot of her own personal problems. Recognizing that she needs time to heal, her company backs off. Instead of hounding her, everyone around Tsukiko is sympathetic and understanding. Everyone, that is, except for a few cynics, who think the timing of the attack was just a little too convenient. After she's interviewed by 2 detectives about the attack, one of them comes up with a shocking idea. Maybe Tsukiko made up the whole thing, and injured herself as a way out of her problems at work. After all, Tsukiko works in a very stressful field. Constantly inventing new characters that the public will love is almost impossible, but it's her bread and butter, and not being able to do it means going broke. Miromi was such a success that it seems like Tsukiko will never make anything like it again. Could the stress and frustration of her job really have caused her to invent an assault that's causing an entire city to panic? The second piece of my little puzzle is the company whose products inspired Miromi to begin with, the real-life character design firm Sanrio. Sanrio began in 1974 with the creation of Hello Kitty, still its most famous character and the face of the company. By 1976, Hello Kitty had spread to the United States and become an international phenomenon, not because of any story she was in, but just as a cute face to be slapped on merchandise. Technically speaking, Hello Kitty had no life story, no real personality, and no dramatic context that would give her any depth. She was just a logo that appealed to people, not much different from the logo of a TV station or a soft drink. But that didn't matter. Hello Kitty was cute, and people bought the stuff that had her image on it, so Sanrio continued. In a reversal of the usual process, Hello Kitty became a popular character first, and then Sanrio invented stories and a personality for her, to give the fans something to grab onto and increase their interest in the franchise. Other endearing mascots were to follow, like My Melody in 1975, Tuxedo Sam in 1979, Keroppi in 1989, Bad Bots Maru in 1993, Cinema Roll in 2001, and most recently the millennial job frustration icon Agretsuko in 2015. In every case, the design process was the same. First, an appealing animal character was envisioned by one of Sanrio's many designers. Then Sanrio's copywriters would invent little factoids about the character to show in promotional materials. And last of all, the characters would be shopped around to be put in commercials, animated TV shows, video games, and other forms of entertainment. But Sanrio was a design company first and foremost. It didn't actually make t-shirts or video games or children's books, just the characters that would appear in them. The whole idea of specialized character design, separate from the production of literary works that use them, is one that Sanrio basically created back in the 70s, and it's still by far the most successful company of its type. If you were inclined to criticize, you could certainly call Sanrio's characters shallow, cutesy, and lacking in personality, but the fact is that when people buy t-shirts, they're not really thinking about how complicated the character on them is. People tend to reduce legitimate fictional characters to stereotypes anyway, so for merchandising purposes, why not make characters who are stereotypes to begin with? Say what you like about it, Sanrio is successful. There's no pretense of being sophisticated or literate, they just use characters to move merchandise, and as far as their customers are concerned, that's win-win. So you might be asking at this point, what do a real-life cat character and a dog mascot from an anime have to do with Pokemon? The answer is merchandising. Pokemon is currently the biggest media franchise in history by sales, and remember that it's not the games that put it there. It's the same things that once put Hello Kitty on top: t-shirts, stuffed animals, and other forms of branded merch. Despite the series' popularity, most people in the United States have never played a Pokemon game. The average person's familiarity with Pokemon comes from the omnipresence of its brand in popular culture, not from first-hand experience of the series' roots. The one Pokemon game that you could say an average person might have played is Pokemon Go, a free mobile app that, let's be frank here, is almost nothing like any real Pokemon game in terms of atmosphere or mechanics. Even fans of the series tend to be more attached to individual Pokemon as characters than they are to other aspects of the games: mechanics, writing, level design, and so on. That's a big reason why Pokemon Go was such a success. It exploited the interest both fans and newcomers had in the Pokemon themselves, and threw the rest of the experience away. In a world full of media franchises that have been merchandised to death, Pokemon fans are right at the top when it comes to buying stuff. When Game Freak first introduced Pokefans as a trainer type in Generation 2, this was a sly dig at its own fanbase, deliberately exaggerated for comedic effect. These days, it's hard to even tell that this is a parody. Pokemon began its existence as a series of interesting, quirky RPGs that featured a variety of appealing characters as a selling point. But now the brand identity of the characters has taken over. It's become a popularity contest, where the biggest stars have entire storylines revolve around them, and the ignored and irrelevant get quietly dumped from the roster. New Pokemon are valued not for how well they fit into the game world, but for the potential they have to be a big hit in the real world. In other words, Pokemon has been Sanrio-fied. Yes, I know I've been making up a lot of weird words lately, but trust me, they're not all that complicated. Sanrio-fication refers to the process by which a media franchise with lots of popular characters slowly becomes a bunch of popular characters who happen to exist in a media franchise. In other words, it's a shifting of emphasis from storytelling to character marketing, in the same way that Sanrio makes characters first, and then finds stories to put them in. The clearest example of this outside of video games, other than Sanrio itself, has got to be comic books. If I asked you what Batman or Superman or Spider-Man are like, the first thing that would pop into your head probably wouldn't be their personalities, in part because there have been so many different works of fiction starring them that none of them actually has a consistent personality. No, the first thing you would think of would be what they look like, and then maybe the names of the villains they face off against and what they look like, their logos and gadgets, and practically anything other than the stories that have featured them. When characters from a franchise get really popular, the company responsible for them usually responds by growing huge, in order to leverage their newfound commercial potential. Unfortunately for Game Freak, whether by chance or intention, it's remained a pretty small company, which makes it almost impossible for it to keep up with the franchise it created. The video games are still the foundation that everything Pokemon-related rests on. They're where all new Pokemon are introduced, where plot points are developed that influence derivative works, and they're the products that influential critics of the franchise are most likely to buy and experience. But the outsized importance of merchandise in this equation means that the franchise is a huge edifice resting on a tiny foundation. It's unbalanced, and the recent release of Sword and Shield brought home to a lot of people the problems that this imbalance can cause. The whole Dexit fiasco was a perfect example of this. Faced with the task of animating more than 800 individual Pokemon in a fully 3D environment, Game Freak decided to cut more than half of them to save development time and effort. But Pokemon as a franchise has spent decades getting people to identify with these Pokemon. It's why people buy t-shirts with their pictures on them, and that means every one of them you cut has the potential to alienate die-hard fans. This is the other side of the Sanrio-fication coin. Once you sell people on a character, trying to change it or get rid of it is a dangerous proposition. Companies that can afford to generally do what Disney does, keep everybody involved and find ways to work every character, no matter how obscure, into your stories. Regrettably, Game Freak can't afford to do that. They're just too small and overworked, especially when you consider just how huge the task of managing Pokemon is. One reason why Sanrio doesn't have much trouble managing its characters is that there aren't that many of them. As far as major ones go, Sanrio's introduced an average of one per year for the last 40 or so years. Pokemon has about 16 times as many major characters, yet its creative team is about 1/5 the size of Sanrio's. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which Game Freak wouldn't experience massive creative burnout and struggle to keep up with the juggernaut of a franchise that it's created. You can see the evidence of this burnout all over Sword and Shield. The game has terrible writing, a lazy, bare-bones story, and derivative mechanics that have barely changed in the last decade. As usual, it has nearly 100 new Pokemon to catch, but no one really cares about any of them, and it seems unlikely that it's going to spawn any new popularity contest winners. Actually, you can see this decline happening even earlier. Look at the last generation, Sun and Moon. Can you name me any new Pokemon from that generation that established a presence in pop culture, or that had a hit product based on it? Have the people who don't play the games even heard any of their names before? Remember, despite the big emphasis on the Alolan forms of existing Pokemon, there were still more than 80 brand new ones that generation. That's almost the same amount as Generation 2 had, and that generation gave us Lugia, Togepi, Pichu, and Unknown. Did the Pokemon Company make a big-budget movie starring any of the Pokemon introduced into the franchise over the last 10 years? Of course not. It used Pikachu, who's been the uncontested #1 phase of the franchise since it started. When it comes to character design, Game Freak is competing with its own past work, and it's losing. Just like Tsukiko Sagi, no matter how hard it tries, it can't seem to live up to its own history of success. The original Pokemon was a very strange and quirky game with a lot of rough edges. It was unbalanced, with lots of RNG-based mechanics that often seemed totally cheap and unfair, and the sprites used for Pokemon were bizarre and creepy about as often as they were cute and adorable. Not only that, but its plot was unusually adult for a game about collecting cute critters. Kanto wasn't an exotic fantasy land so much as it was a thinly fictionalized version of the real Japan. This is a place where you have to bribe guards in order to get into a major city, where a battling tournament turns out to be a front to recruit children into a crime syndicate, where the most powerful criminal mastermind in the world is an official Pokemon League gym leader. But in a way, this quirkiness was one of the series' greatest strengths. Mechanics like confusion and critical hits were unfair, sure, but they also made battles more dramatic and kept them from feeling like generic RPG slapfests. The sprites were certainly weird, but they were also charming in a very distinct way, in contrast to the polished but predictable style that many of them have now. And as for the dark elements of the early game stories, that's something which later games have tried and failed to replicate, with melodramatic, save-the-world storylines of the kind that most of us have seen way too often. Starting around Generation 3, the franchise's rough edges started to be sanded off. Battle mechanics became less random, the sprites cuter and more streamlined. Items like the experience share went from being a minor tool used for grinding to a full-blown easy mode, one which the latest generation insists that you use. The knowledge that fans have about previous installments is totally disregarded. Instead, helpful NPCs dump exposition on you and hold your hand constantly as if you've never played any video game before. Pokemon used to be the Earthbound of portable gaming. Now it's more like the Dragon Quest. Sanrio-fication has made the games more polished and in some ways better, but it's also made them less unique and less interesting. But is this really such a bad thing? After all, a lot of people like Dragon Quest. A lot of people like polish. A lot of people would rather play an easy and unchallenging game than a frustrating, unpredictable one. Why couldn't the developers just keep going on like this? Keep Sanrio-fying, until by 2050 they have 2,000 unique Pokemon, and the games are just like any other RPG. You know why they can't do that. Game Freak is too small, and it refuses to get bigger. It can't keep up with its own franchise, and one reason why Sword and Shield is so frustrating is that it marks the point where Game Freak stopped trying to keep up. Instead, they decided to cut content, and this is where an important question pops up. Why did Game Freak decide to cut the older Pokemon from the Pokédex, which already had an established presence and a fanbase, instead of just not introducing a bunch of new Pokemon? For the past several generations, Game Freak couldn't have avoided noticing that new Pokemon have tended to be less popular and successful than their counterparts from previous generations. Yet at no point did they say to themselves, why don't we just stop making these? If a sacrifice has to be made, the obvious choice would be to stop making new characters, since they're a drain on resources that would be better spent maintaining characters who already make money. But here's the rub. Game Freak at heart is full of people who want to be creative. They lavish that creativity on the new Pokemon in each generation, and it would break their heart to give up on that for the sake of making an extra buck. These are the same people who keep making side projects that come out every 5 years or so, even though everyone knows that Pokemon is the only thing that ever makes them a decent profit, and justifies their existence to the bigwigs at Nintendo. People who choose a career inventing characters generally do it for the same reason anyone chooses a career, because it's what they love. If Sanrio had devoted itself entirely to marketing Hello Kitty back in the 70s, no one would care about it today. Instead, it encouraged its employees to create new characters, like Agretsuko, and these days it's more relevant than it's been in decades. Game Freak is probably holding out hope that its dedication to new characters will do something similar for it. It's a shame that, at the same time, it's been compromising and cutting corners on other aspects of the games it puts out. And it has to be said, it's also a shame that lots of Pokemon fans will buy those games anyway, regardless of the outrage, and regardless of how many corners get cut. But Sword and Shield may just be a watershed moment for this franchise. There's never been this strong a backlash to the decisions being made at Game Freak, or such a contrast between the traditionally middle-of-the-road ratings given by critics and the tongue-lashing that's come from fans. Game Freak seems to have thought that it could get away with half-assing the mechanics and world of its games, while saving its limited energy for the task of creating new Pokemon that most people don't end up caring about. This is doubly annoying for fans. It means that they get a mediocre game experience, and face the possibility of one of their favorite Pokemon losing its place to some stupid ice cube penguin, or an apple, or a... what the hell is this? Pokemon fans are legendarily loyal and quick to part with their cash, but this may be the point where even they start to have second thoughts, and if they do, this entire franchise could fall to pieces right before our eyes. So, if it seems to you like this video was kind of sloppily edited and put together, that's because it kind of was. I've had the idea to do a video like this for a long time, but it was only about a week ago that I sat down and finally cranked out a script. Then, since it was the holidays, I ended up spending a lot of time doing family stuff and putting this video on the back burner. In the end, I recorded the audio for this video, saved and edited the images, and finally put the whole thing together in just a couple of days. I wanted to make this a special episode, so it was important to me to get it out by Christmas, even though this video doesn't have much to do with Christmas. And that means that whether or not my initial ideas were good, this video is always going to suffer from not being as well thought out as it could be. In other words, I wanted to make a good video, but a combination of conflicting priorities, lack of focus, and rushing to meet an arbitrary deadline caused me to put out a product that didn't live up to my own standards. If I'd been more focused, or given myself more time to work on this, it probably would have been a lot better. And no matter how many of my viewers might be willing to excuse one low-quality video because I've done things they liked before, I really ought to do better by them, and myself. I think you can probably imagine the point I'm trying to make by giving you this little behind-the-scenes expose of my own shortcomings. What I'm trying to say about the way a lot of entertainment companies seem to be operating these days, and one video game developer in particular. And if you don't get what I'm talking about, then you probably work for Game Freak. Oh, and Merry Christmas, by the way.